The one labeled, yeah, you. New phone? Yeah, you are your name?
Yes. Hi. I assume you're talking to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I apologize. I was going to change my screen name. My name is Jared Dowd. Oh, I'm going to update that.
Thank you.
You bet.
Okay. We'll get started here in just a minute. For those of you that attended the seminar last week, it was nice to meet you in person. I hope it was worth your time and effort to get there. As if you've been participating in these meetings, you know I haven't had the best of health. Friday was a great day for me, so I felt really fantastic, and it was great to see you all. I like to think I'm kind of on the mend now. If you guys will look in the chat, you'll see that I put a link to the Cafferetta paper. Um, that is the one that talks about 100-year flood flow. That is in addition to the Forest Ranch and Roads Handbook that's available on the board's website under Professional Foresters Registration. It's an excellent little paper. It's really not very long, but it's very good in terms of culvert and crossing design. It is specific to 100-year flood flow, and that'll be part of our topic for tonight. So I encourage you to study that. It's not dense. It's easy to read. It's easy to figure out. It's very handy if you're designing any kind of culvert crossings. So you should grab a hold of that and download it. I will bring it up.
You sent it with the meeting invite?
No, it's in the meeting chat right now. You look at the chat box on the right hand side, you'll see a thing to the.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So, as we discovered last week, the keywords are up, and hopefully most of you received my spreadsheet. So I'm going to share my screen now. And we're going to go right to that. Hang on here, let me do a couple of things. So hopefully you all can see this.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. All right. So what I did was I took the keywords, and again, the proviso here is that keywords are not an answer for a question key, right? They even have a disclaimer on it now that says only about 50% of these will be on the exam, because people were under the impression and had complained like, well, this wasn't ever on the exam. Well, it's not meant to be something that covers the whole exam. It's meant to be like there's things in here that are on the exam, other things they think it's good for you to know. It's not meant to like tell you exactly what's on the exam. But that said, it's an excellent study aid. And so what I did was I took their keywords and then I put them in an Excel spreadsheet. And then what you do, and this is going to be one of your assignments here for the next couple of days, you can start with what I gave you. Take the ones out of the column A and group them. However you feel you want to group them. In this case, I did one for roads. I've got one now on mine that I started doing while I was just waiting for a year. For silviculture, one for mensuration. You can group it however you want. But that's up to you. But the thing about grouping it is it helps focus your study on certain issues. So if you guys can, let me just put this up a little bit more. You guys look at the roads column here under column B. That was just me going through in about, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes or so and thinking, well, that belongs there, that belongs there. May or may not be part of the question, but we'll get back to that a little bit. But you see what I did here was roads. Best management practices, maybe, maybe not. Culvert discharge capacity, flood flow, inlet control, peak flows, permanent road, reconstruction of existing crossings, road grades, road maintenance, roads and skid trails, some on its stream, some on its maybe, maybe not. Stream flow discharge, stream bed alteration, Talbot's equation, temporary road, watercourse crossing design, California nomograph method. I threw in a separate thing there, mitigation measures, mitigations, monitoring, may or may not be part of that roads thing. You'll note that certain things have crossover and may end up in a different question than one general question. But you can see here that this suggests that there's a 50-50 shot at least of a question being asked on the exam that goes into great detail on culverts and crossings. So we're going to cover part of that tonight, just to give you an idea. But I want you all to take this spreadsheet that I've given you and start using it to like group your things for study. Does that make sense? Good? Okay, let me just see here. I gotta move a few things around on my screen here. Come on. All right. Gotta make sure I have that over there. Okay. So you can see some of these things have appeared 2 or 3 times on the last few set of keywords, so that may or may not mean anything. I don't know. You can see that in my silviculture, if you're looking at this here, you can see I put in California black oak, coast redwood, silviculture method, silvicultural system, and image stands, free thinning, selection regeneration, shelterwood regeneration, shelterwood seed step, reforestation, regeneration survey, quadrat. Because after all, the definition of silviculture is the entire life cycle and characteristics of trees. So it could be planting, it could be harvest, it could be anything that involves the entire life cycle. Yes, so Christopher asked, would policy be a good division? Sure. You could, if you wanted, have one for each of the 10 fields of discipline that you're required to, that the RPF examination is required to go after. So like there could be one for mensuration, there could be one for protection, there could be one for engineering, there could be one for ecology, there could be one for policy, management, economics, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't have to be any particular thing. In this case, I chose roads, which is technically engineering. But it's up to you, however you want to do it. Whatever helps you study. And then you see I started mensuration, there's 3P sampling. So the silviculture column, the point being, is kind of a little bit all over the place because, you know, I've got silviculture, I've got tree species, which is dendrology, which has kind of been lumped in with silviculture these days, primarily because we occasionally have a question where there's a chart or a table where numerous species are in it, and you're supposed to talk about, like, what's the best seed bed, what's the method of regeneration, what's that. You're supposed to talk about the silvics of the tree, which is part and parcel of it. But there's also harvest methods and the like, so it could be any number of things. Now, if you're looking at past questions, you might be able to make some assumptions. Well, if they're asking about this, it'd probably be a question that's similar to this. And that question could be part of your study. In fact, I recommend it, and hopefully we'll work through one here in just a second. But this is your assignment. I want you to try and group these things. It will help focus your study. I had a dad joke about, like, does anyone know what free thinning means? Serious question. Anyone know what free thinning means? Raise your hand if you do. Go ahead, Rachel.
It's the thinning of a stand without regard to crown dominance.
Right. I've always called this a weeding job. So, like, you go through and you take out all the unhealthy individuals or individuals for spacing, but it has nothing to do with whether they're dominant, codominant, subdominant, whatever. It's just you're removing trees, not necessarily for production, but because they're taking up resources and you just want to get them out of there. The dad joke was, if I thin here tomorrow, would you still remember me? Does anyone get that joke? It's a dad joke. Come on. You guys know.
I think it's a lyric out of a Beatles song.
No, it's Leonard Skinner.
Skinner all the way.
Anyway, dad joke. You're going to get them from time to time from my dad. Cree, do you have a question?
No, you had asked us to raise our hand on free thinning.
Got it.
I just forgot it.
You just put in the chat, we did sanitation based on disease, tree structure, vigor. Exactly. That's exactly right. If you look at the definition in the SAF dictionary, it says more or less the same thing, but it adds in what Rachel said, which is without regard to crown position, right? You're not thinking about, like, I'm going to thin the dominance or I'm going to thin the codominance. You're thinking about how you're going to get this done, right? So, and Riley, feel free to use my dad joke tomorrow with Van Lennep or whoever. I'm sure they'd appreciate it. Okay. I'm sure it'll go over well.
Yeah, well, I think that was a ballad of Curtis Lowe. Now it's like, where's that coming from?
So, when you have keywords like this, there's a couple things you should do. Okay, so you start grouping them, that's good. That'll help focus your study. But the other thing is, hopefully you all have gone on the board's website at this point and gotten a copy of the California Forest Practice Act and rules electronically. So not a bad idea, not a bad practice to take these words and search the document for them. Because occasionally what you'll get is According to the FPRs, what does this mean? So start with that. The second thing is, if you have an SAF dictionary, search it to see where these are. That's why I used free thinning. Free thinning is in the SAF dictionary. And oftentimes, if we're asking for definitions like this, we're relying on either the Forest Practice Act and rules, or relying on the SAF dictionary. The third thing you can do is you can use Google. Google is your friend, and search for some of these terms. You'd be surprised at what kind of information that leads you to. If you're looking at something that is very forestry specific, you might find a forestry website that's just chock full of information. I've found many just by doing that kind of a thing, where I searched for something. So something to bear in mind, in this era of electronics, you have a wonderful study tool. This will help you focus. This will help you drill down into things that are important. Everyone clear on what the concept and what the assignment is? Okay. We will review some of that next week. If you guys want to share your spreadsheets, you can. I can't guarantee that I'll have time to like go through them other than like a 2 or 3 minute scan to make sure that you don't have things totally backwards, right? But I will try. I'll just give you a quick thumbs up, thumbs down. Looks good if you wanna do that. All right. The other thing I wanted to do, you guys, are you guys seeing the Cafarata paper here? Yeah. Okay. Good.
You know, YG, before we move on from the forest practice rules thing, I called the office today to see if they're still mailing out the little hard copies. And it's been a few years since I had one of those little field kind of bounded copies. Do you know, are they still mailing those out occasionally?
So, for a price,
Okay.
right now, you can get the 2023 purple book for the low price of basically nothing, because they're going to come out with the 2024 pretty quick. If you go into like your local unit, like if you're in Eureka, you go to the Fortuna unit. Oh, Jane, do you have something to add?
So we haven't printed the 2024 version yet.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, Jane. I'm just saying that the 2023.
You can get that for a song.
Yeah, you can get
that for a smile.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. So you can get the 2023. It won't have the 2024 changes in it, but it's still basically valid. I mean, it still has much everything in it. If you want a copy, the thing that they've done, I should add, is I don't know. Does anyone know what they're charging these days? Because it was $5, and then I think they raised it $9. Okay. So yeah, they've had problems with printing it in the past, and the last couple of years, they really pulled back on printing it. And they were also very short-staffed in trying to get it out. So it was kind of hard. I expect this year will be better, and you'll be able to get a copy. That they'll probably make a few more copies this year. They kind of had to cut back, but just FYI. But for your study purposes, the electronic copy is your friend, because you can search it and you can cut and paste with it. The other one's great for just you're out in the woods or you're just sitting around and looking at things randomly. But for a study aid, the electronic copy is kind of hard to beat. You'll notice here too that I have the design this is what that document looks like if you haven't already obtained it. Oops, no. Here we go. Okay, so hopefully you can all see now the series of questions. These are the short questions that we've talked about in the past. And Dan, true to his word, updated it. Now, up till the last exam, I think this was the last one, 462, define the following financial decision method, right? So Dan has added, with no numbers, the new short answer questions from 2020 to 23 on the tail end, and I think there's about 9-10 pages of them. So they're all intact and in there now. Again, for your purposes of your study, if you just do Google searches for information about each of these and start answering them, I'm sure you'll get there. There might be a few that you can't get. But you'll notice some of them look quite familiar from my previous lectures. So like this particular one, what does this drawing depict and what's its function? It's a short answer as well as part of a larger question that we did answer a week or two ago, right? Remember when we talked about the risers? There's various things in here that very helpful. But these are the more contemporary questions. Okay, so make sure you download a copy of that off the Professional Foresters registration site under exams/study materials. Very helpful. All right. So hopefully all y'all see this question, which I think I sent to you this afternoon. And you'll notice here in this particular question, which is a question from October 2020, so 3.5 years ago, you'll notice that like the very first question says, for permanent and seasonal roads, the California Forest Practice Rules requires a minimum design storm flood flow for watercourse crossings. Define the term flood flow and specify the minimum flood flow required by regulation on permanent road stream crossings. Well, flood flow is one of your keywords that I just gave you that I grouped into rows. So if this question, if there's a 50-50 shot, this question is going to appear on the exam. Is essentially what they're saying. So let's talk about that question. Let me grab my notes. A couple of important points about this, because there's a couple of different definitions, and I'll just say it this way. The straight or the most accurate thing is the number of years within which the storm discharge runoff will be equaled or exceeded once on the average, expressed in years. So if you have a 100-year flood flow, you've got a 1% chance of exceeding it. However, if you do the search in the California Forest Practice Act and rules, it says it a little differently. Means the magnitude of peak flow that would on average be equaled or exceeded once every specified period of years. And that's a little different. Rest assured that if you basically come up with something that says to the effect that it is the flow that will exceed a specified amount in a given return interval, I'm probably going to be pretty good as a grader. I'm not looking for, the nuances of those two definitions. Will, do you have any problem with that? What I just said? Would you express it differently?
Problem is that we statistically base it off of a record that may not be accurate anymore. That's all.
Yeah. You're talking to a guy who was 7 years old in 1964. And in 1964, we had the 1,000-year flood. I mean, it was an unusual circumstance because it was a rain on snow event at Christmas time. Very unusual. Fun to see all the bridges blown out.
Yeah, 100-year flow is just, in my mind, imagine you use all the equations and stats and then imagine worst case scenario. That's all.
That's a good way of looking at it. It's a construct. It's not dissimilar to, in my mind, the way that I think, to scaling. So we scale logs, and does that scale actually have any real bearing on the kind of boards that get produced? No, it doesn't, because each mill is different. Each mill has its own efficiencies, has its own way of recovering material, but it is a baseline. So the scale is the same from mill to mill to mill to mill because it's a standard. A 100-year flood flow is a standard to which we design. It may or may not have any basis on whether this happens in a given time period or not. It's just a flow that we use. It's a baseline. That's the way I look at it personally. Whether or not it occurs on average once every 100 years or has a 1% chance of happening in a given year, to me is almost irrelevant. It's a baseline that we design to. Okay, so in the Cafferata, it talks a little bit about some of these equations. It does not talk about, the next part is the three common methodologies used to design peak flows for a return period are the rational equation, also known as the California nomograph method. And if you'll notice, that's two keywords in our list. Rational equation, California nomograph method. I'm sure many of you that have worked in operations have seen the California nomograph method in action. It's handy. It just basically takes the equation and puts it into the form of a nomograph where you start at one end, you draw a straight line, intersects with another line, up until you get a proposed diameter. It's a way. But if you go into the Cafferata paper, it discusses a little bit about it. It's a simple formula for me to remember because it's Q equals CIA. And so essentially what you're talking about in the rational is that you're trying to talk about the flood. Q is the flood discharge for whatever time period you're doing. In this case, we're doing, say, 100 year. So what's the flood discharge for a 100-year event in cubic feet per second? So that's it. You're trying to get to the discharge at a particular point where your crossing is. The C is the coefficient, and that's the amount of runoff you're supposed to get based on the soil, what kind of vegetative cover, what kind of topography you have. And, the I is the intensity of the storm. Now, A being area. So is it a good method? Well, it's fine for small watersheds. Once you get to a larger watershed, may or may not be in the ballpark at all. It's a nice, easy one to use just to like kind of get your bearings on what kind of a culvert you might have if you have a fairly small one. Time of concentration is kind of the key thing here, and that's not always super well understood. I mean, you have a burn. This equation will change if the whole thing's burned over. So you're going to adjust your vegetative cover, and maybe you don't have the best rainfall data. Not every watershed has great rainfall data. You'll have something that is generally good for an area, but not necessarily for your watershed. That's the rational. But the Cafferata paper talks about it. And if you look online, there's lots of stuff. If you have any of your books from college, rational's always like part of the deal. USGS, regional flood frequency equations. These are similar. They're an equation, but they're based on a particular region. And again, the way this question is worded, for any two methodologies describe the inputs and the terms, define all symbols and or variables used, and give the units of output and input variables. Be sure to discuss limitations and assumptions. So, are they looking for you to put down the equation? No. Notice it doesn't say that. It doesn't say, please, if it would have just said, please write the equation for these three and talk about their limitations. So what I did with the rational there was I talked about, it's about a design flow based on topography, based on rainfall intensity, based on area. If you use a variable, you should define it. So if you did write Q equals CIA, you're going to want to define those things. But if you don't, all we're looking for is a general description. So going on to, again, back to the regional flood, it is a little bit different in that it has these equations by region. So it has a geographic province kind of thing. And then it talks about the precipitation and runoff data for that region. So I'm not going to recite the equation here. I'll leave it to you guys to do it. But what you're really looking for here is that, again, Q is the same. You're looking for that flow for whatever the return interval is. It has certain coefficients that are germane to that particular region, but it also has area, precipitation, and it has what's known as an altitude index. But each one is modified by a coefficient. So what are the limitations? The rational equation I just said it's really good for a small watershed area. These equations are made for large areas. They're taking data over a large area. So it's not necessarily site specific. You can have a lot of variation within a region. If you're covering a large area, it may or may not apply. And it doesn't talk about vegetation. So it's not really talking about what kind of impediments to runoff there might be. Doesn't really talk about topography like the other one did. So that's part of it. But it is easy, like the rational. And it is based, because it covers a wide area, it's based on a lot of data. Questions so far? That's what we're getting at with a question like this. Now, Talbot's, which is the last of the three, is talking about the cross-sectional area of the culvert. So it will give you the cross-sectional area of the culvert in square feet, which you can then work back into a diameter. And so it has as variables the runoff coefficient, which is like the rational equation, the C in CIA, and it gives you the drainage area above in acres. But it has limitations because it's based on a very simplified model of like a 4, I think it's like a 4-inch per hour storm. And how realistic is that? And it's based on data that was done not here. So Talbot's may or may not be very accurate either. And it's simple to use. So all these things are great in terms of equations, and what they are is office methods for coming up with a culvert diameter. In practice, what you would be doing when you're laying out a road, and this is not necessarily in the question, but I just want to make sure we cover it. In practice, you would be laying out your road, you'd come to a crossing, and you would examine the crossing and you'd measure the crossing. Because at the end of the day, what you're going to want is to determine what bank full stage is. And if you read the Cafferata paper, it does an excellent job of describing how you come up with bank full stage and how you calculate from there what the desired culvert diameter is. So in culvert design, what I always did was I would use at least 2 of these methods to come up with a horseback estimate of what I might be talking about at a particular place. But at the end of the day, the culvert diameter would be determined by what I found on the ground. And I would be doing actual measurements to figure out what's going to work best at that particular point. I'm going to pick on you again, Will. How'd I do? Is that okay?
I think so. From having talked and spent a lot of time with Don Lindsay, exactly what he says of there's equations and there's the stuff you put down on paper and Excel sheets, etc. And then there's professional discretion within the field and what the field demands. So I don't know a better way to say it other than in the field, you can make a call.
Yeah. And by the way, just as a plug, I don't know if Sonette's on tonight, but don't forget, end of the month, CLFA workshop. One of our speakers, besides Will, is going to be Don Lindsay, and he's going to be talking about stuff like this. Just saying. Don's the one that told me a lot of this stuff, so I can tell you that, like, when you design these things with nomographs and all that, they're great for like having it in the back of your pocket. It may tell you, oh, a 36 is going to work. Then you get out there and you look at the crossing, and you go like, nah, I'm not comfortable with this. This can probably stand a 48. There's a lot of crap up the hill. I want to make sure this thing works. Or vice versa, you get out there and it tells you one thing and you go like, man, that's way overkill for what I got going here. I might be able to get away with an 18 here. Make sure you design it with a critical dip. Okay. Question 3. As most mountain watercourse crossings on forest road systems operate under inlet control conditions, define the term inlet control and discuss 3 variables that influence a culvert's discharge capacity under inlet control. If I'm not mistaken, inlet control is another keyword. Could be wrong about that, but I think inlet control is in there too. Okay, so inlet control. So if the culvert has a good enough slope to it, so in other words, it's like a slope that like matches the terrain. You've got it at grade, in other words. The only thing that's going to prevent flow from going through is stuff that happens at the inlet. That's an inlet control system. And most times what you're going to have is an inlet control system. So the flow is, the discharge is all going to be controlled by the size of the pipe and the inlet efficiency. So inlet could be a projecting inlet, it could be a mitered inlet, in other words, something that's shaped to allow for a greater channel for the water to like enter the culvert better. Or it could have a head wall. Sometimes you'll see that on some permanent roads where a head wall is constructed around the inlet to allow the water to like pond up a little bit and then go through the culvert. Those are all things that factor in. You have the inlet controlling how much water goes into the pipe. Inlet control. So how much headwater depth, how much cross-sectional area, what type of inlet.
Would that also include like trash racks and things to help with debris?
Yeah, although this is about variables, not necessarily about the design. So the variable, it's more of a variable in terms of that comes down to like the diameter or the inlet, the head wall or whatever, right? Trash rack is actually more of a design feature than it is a controlling factor in the hydraulic flow. If you know what I mean. Yes, things can happen that will impact that thing, but I'm not sure trash rack really fits what they're trying to ask for here. If the watercourse crossing under consideration is a salmonid stream, briefly discuss 5 items that you would consider in the crossing's design, location, or installation to facilitate enhanced fisheries at the crossing. Now, this is one of the reasons why I threw those. If you saw my spreadsheet, you saw I threw in salmonid stuff, right? Key factor in culvert design is if you have a salmonid stream, it's especially if you're in ASP watersheds, you have to have it designed so that it can allow for all stages, all life cycle stages of the fish to use. So small, big, whatever, they've got to be able to use that culvert. So what are the things to consider? There's lots of things you can put. Knowing that the size of your more groundless and specific dimensions is very particular reason we see these including in THPs also defining them including. Okay, let me step back to the question in the chat. The reason those equations are asked for in the THP is just to show that you did your due diligence. They are not necessarily binding. You may get into some discussion and debate with review team agencies over it. But let's say that my nomograph told me 48, but then I went out and looked at bankful stage, and the design that I came up with was 36. You know, it's a matter of explaining and justifying, not just saying it's 36. They want to know what your thought process was to get to the 36. That's all it is. It's just, how did you come up with 36? What was your rationale? My rationale was I did this, it indicated this, then I went out and did a field ground truthing, and I came up with this. And if you're doing it right, a guy like Will Olson will come out there and say, yeah, that's exactly right. Guaranteed. Every time. It's more of a thought process. That's what THPs have become. The first THPs were more based on your own professional discretion, and you could just say, this is what I'm doing, I'm a professional, trust me. Well, CEQA doesn't allow for that kind of discretion. You have to show that you actually gave this consideration. Under CEQA, you have to show everything. You have to show how you came up with your silvicultural system, how you came up with your road design, how you came up with your culvert design. This is more just adding to the basis for how you came to your conclusion. We'll get to that in a second, Edwin. So what kind of considerations in the design, location, or installation facilitate enhanced fisheries at this crossing? So, in a sense, erosion is always the consideration, Edwin. You're always trying to create a crossing that will minimize the impacts to the water quality. But there's other considerations too. So like if I came up to a fish-bearing stream and I had my calculations in hand, I'm looking at it, I might have an instance where I go, I feel much better putting a flat car bridge over this thing. I don't want to mess with this, and the terrain applies. So like you get like a thing, it's perfect. You can just drag a bridge right across it, set it up, away you go. You don't have to even do hardly any work. A bridge might make more sense, especially if it's going to be part of a permanent road network. Most times when you're building across a fish-bearing stream, it's going to be more or less a permanent road network, but not always, but a lot of times it will be. If it's a permanent culvert, you're going to want to have it so that fish can move upstream and downstream. Any listed aquatic species for that matter, during any life stage. So whether it's fry or adults or juveniles, you're gonna want to have a culvert design that allows for that. So you don't want to have something that's too high velocity. You don't want to have something that like has a shotgunned end. You want to have something that allows them to easily traverse those culverts, to be as transparent as you possibly can. You know, I don't know if any of you have ever worked with like multi-plate arches. You know, it's like a culvert, but like you put in like plates that's like almost like a half culvert. You can do a half culvert too, for that matter, if you have that. So that you keep the bed intact, the stream bed intact, and you just put that over the top, and then you put the road over the top of that. What you want to do is allow for that stream bed to be as natural as possible. So again, all those things, you don't want them to have to jump into the culvert. You want to have that culvert on grade. You want to make sure that the flow going through the pipe is not faster than the fish can handle. So you want to make sure it's as natural to the grade as you can. Length. So like sometimes that's an issue too on a crossing. You don't want to have it too ridiculously long. Because during low discharge, if you have a really long culvert, during low discharge, there may not be enough water in the culvert for them to move through because it gets dispersed. Going back to the question about trash racks, trash rack design is also important because if you do it wrong, you're a barrier to fish migration. You don't want to have a trash rack that's going to impede them going up and downstream. Sometimes, and I've done this many eons ago, you can create resting pools. So you might need that. It's kind of a tricky thing to design, but sometimes you can do it at the culvert outlet. And they may need some kind of a resting area upstream too, or they may need rocks and boulders upstream and things like that. So that's all part of your consideration as you're putting it in. Going back to the Edwin's question, riprap armoring to prevent erosion, to impede water quality, or that will affect water quality. You want to make sure the culvert's installed in alignment with the channel. I've seen people get screwed up and not put the culvert in exactly in alignment with the channel. That's kind of important. Trying to think of anything else. All those things are important. Go ahead, Rachel.
I did this question with someone else, and they brought up setting the culvert at subgrade, so like a little bit flatter than the natural grade, and maybe also oversizing it and burying it like a quarter of its diameter so that it fills in with natural sediment.
That's a great design tactic. It kind of gets back to what I was talking about with half arch or bottomless culvert. It's kind of the same thing, just done a little different. In this case, you're burying the culvert, which is in essence like making it a half arch. So it's important though that like if you said my calculation says it's an 18 or no, my calculation says a 36, and then you get to burying it, you just effectively reduce the diameter. So that's kind of what you're getting at about oversize. It's not technically oversizing, it's just you're going to have to use a bigger diameter in order to accomplish that.
So making sure that your oversized culvert, after it fills in with gravel, the cross-sectional area needs to be the same as whatever you sized it out as.
Ding, ding, ding. You get a cigar.
My guess is too, like burying a pipe, like that would probably even be a different permit because now you're digging up the base of the real channel, right? So now you're digging in the channel to set that pipe lower versus doing like these big squash pipes where you're just essentially setting that pipe right over the top of the channel. You probably have some level of a 1600, but it seems like it would be different than just like, I'm going to dig out a 50-foot stretch. I'm going to dig out the natural bottom 6 inches to set this pipe lower. I would think that would be a different level of permitting, would be my guess.
No, but it'd be a different level of scrutiny.
Yeah.
A 1600 permit is anything for alteration of bed, bank, and channel. So you're altering the channel. And so it would be covered under a 1600. It's just that you would have additional scrutiny because of what you're proposing.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, so Riley, that's another consideration. If you're doing this, are you doing any kind of a diversion of the stream? You might be, you might not. That's a consideration in the design. I'll be honest with you and say that if I have a fish-bearing stream, and what we just talked about here is all these different kinds of design tactics, if it gets a little too complicated, and you're gonna have to divert the stream, you're gonna have to dig up the channel, you're gonna have to put in this, you're gonna have to do that. All that's arguing in favor of the bridge. Now, the bridge may not be practical and it may not work there, but I will tell you that every time I've had to, especially with deeply incised channels, I find that the bridge is a lot less problematic. Because basically all I got to do is get a cat on the other side and winch that rascal across and put it in place. If the ground's stable enough, I might not even need much of a footing.
What's the deal on engineered bridges nowadays? Do you have to have an engineered bridge, or the old flat car bridges still kind of acceptable?
It depends, and that's all I can really say. It's been an ongoing issue now for 20 years. It depends on the situation. If all you're using it for is log truck traffic or forest management traffic, you're probably going to be just fine in utilizing the bridge. If you have a situation where the public's using it at all, you're probably going to have to go the engineered route. Could be wrong about that, but that's the way I have interpreted what I've heard over the years. Is once anything beyond a private landowner using it for their own forest management purposes, you start to ratchet up pretty quickly. What other things? We covered a lot there. Always important that when you put in a crossing that you make sure that if you've got exposed mineral soil, you stabilize it. I mentioned riprap, armoring, uphill, downhill, but you might also have a straw mulch situation, seeding, something like that for certain areas. The last question in this particular thing is for the temporary class of roads in the FPR, describe the watercourse crossing requirements required by the FPR and steps in the final disposition of such crossings. So heretofore we're talking about permanent and seasonal and all that kind of stuff. This is temporary. And the difference is that when you go to a temporary, you're not necessarily designing it for a specific flood flow. Okay, because the bottom line is the temporary has to carry the flow, the kind of discharge when you're using it. So let's say you're only using it in August and the thing barely runs any water in August. It might be a gully washer in December and January, or February, like right now. But during the time you use it, there's no water in it. Well, so maybe you just use a 12-inch. But because they're temporary, what's that mean? Anyone want to take a guess of what happens with a temporary crossing?
It's supposed to be removed and set back to pre-use.
Yep, pulled before winter period. I see you guys all jumping in the chat. Perfect. you gotta yank that thing. And so you're gonna have to pull it for the winter period. That's the main difference. You're gonna still have to do, you may have to do some additional erosion control work with a temporary crossing, but generally speaking, they're a lot more straightforward. It's temporary. You're just using it for a short period of time, then you're pulling it. This is one of the reasons why, and I don't know how much people use them anymore, but the old Spittler crossings work the best for me in the Redwood region because you put a bundle of logs with a choker around it, you stick it in there, you use the road, and when you're done, you hook up to the choker and you yank the whole thing out. And if you did it right, everything comes with it. And you just set it there and you're done. Spittler crossings are great. Good, Electra. I'm glad to hear that people still use the Spittler. I think that was one of the finest things that anybody ever came up with. They work really, really, really well. You don't have to worry about getting a culvert in there. You just use available material. Okay, so that's how that question was shaped. And now let's just go back real quick here to the keywords. So hopefully you can all see this. The keywords are back up, right? Yes. Culvert discharge capacity, flood flow, inlet control, peak flows, permanent road, reconstruction of existing crossings, road grades, road maintenance, not so much. Samonid stream flow discharge, stream bed alteration, Talbot's equation, temporary road, watercourse crossing design, California nomograph method. Bing. I just showed you where all those keywords were used in a question. That's the purpose of the keywords, is to focus you on a particular area to study. And we just covered a whole ton of them. So again, to emphasize it, you should really work hard on doing that. You have to find I suggest that you go back. I gave you both these questions, correct? I've got another second question I'm going to cover here, but I gave them both to you. I suggest you go back and you try and write out an answer for each of these things. Go through those keywords, study them, and then try and write out an answer. I also suggest that you kind of time yourself to get an idea of how long it takes you to do that. You should budget no more than an hour to write this out, but it is good practice for putting your thoughts down. Right now, you're all saying, well, this is pretty good. This is obvious. I get it. Come the test time, it's a little different when you're writing it out. So just try and do this as a timed exercise. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. Don't have like a little thing going there, but say, okay, it's 2 o'clock. I'm going to start doing this. And by 3 o'clock, you look and see how you did and look at the answer and see if it's acceptable. It's a good practice. I've given you a good shot at how to look at that. All right. Let me go to the other part of your assignment for this coming week. I'm going to cover a little bit of this, but I'm not going to go into great detail because this is where I really want you guys to focus over the next few days. I've given you keywords, I've given you a short answer, I've given you some study methods, I've given you an example question for you to practice on, but this is the kind of the nub of the issue and will most likely be our last engineering question before we move on to other topics. Just want to make sure I covered this. If you attended the seminar on Friday, you heard Mr. Lindstrand say there was one question we had that had a map and it was really great. It was one of the best questions we ever had. And I nudged him and said, that's next week's lecture, or that's the next lecture one. This is the question he was alluding to. It is a really good question. It's an awesome question. So, you have accepted a job to provide a forest landowner with a preliminary plan for harvest access within the timber property she has just acquired. The first report from you should consider the following requirements and goals. Provide a map showing the property lines.
Hi.
Outline a feasible road plan, which is located on the owner's property and which considers the owner's goals and constraints and is disconnected from the watershed. Avoid substantial damage to wet areas, springs, and streams by minimizing construction and crossings of those areas. Assume that the land will be used for timber production and the land is zoned TPZ. The most likely direction of future timber hauling will be to the west. That's important because however you design this road network, it's got to be like gunning towards the west. All right. In this particular question, they provide you with two maps. You're not going to have to do both. One is meant to be like if you're scratching it out and you want to see how it works. And then the other one is your final map. So here on the attached map, draw property lines as close as possible to the as close as possible on the map provided based on the following description from the grantee. Note that the center of section 34 is marked by the number 34 in the lower left-hand quadrant of the map. So this is important because you guys should understand legal descriptions. We often have questions about legal descriptions. Section 34, the west half of the northeast quarter and the southwest quarter of the northeast quarter of the northeast quarter and the north half of the north half of the northwest quarter of the southeast quarter. Clear as mud, correct? All right. Let's look at the map. Here's your map. Kind of blown it up a little bit here. 34. And you see a map with that number, that's the center of the section. That means that all this area from here over to here is the northeast quarter of that section 34. This is the northeast quarter of section 34. Okay. So when you're drawing it on, I just want to get you guys squared away here. The west half of the northeast quarter, that's your biggest chunk. Now, I'm just gonna, let me just make this a little bit smaller for the purposes of showing you what I'm gonna do. This is the northeast quarter. The west half of the northeast quarter, you're not going to do it exactly this way. Let's just see if I can get this to work. Is that east half of the northeast quarter, west half of the northeast quarter. Okay, so we got that section. What's the next thing here? I need to go to my notes again. The southwest quarter of the northeast quarter of the northeast quarter. The southwest. Okay, so this is the northeast quarter of the northeast quarter. But what we want is the southwest quarter. That's a little bit off in terms of scale. It should probably be more like about that.
Kitty, go away. Go away.
Oops. Here.
Go away. Go away. Okay, come on. Come on.
Anyone not get what I just did? The final thing is
Oh,
the
okay.
north half of the north half of the northwest quarter of the southeast quarter. So this is the northeast quarter, this is the southeast quarter, and what they want is the northwest quarter, which is right here, the northwest quarter of the southeast quarter, and the north half of the north half. That is going to be roughly that. And then I'll just take this out. That is the property. I want you to follow along as best you can and do this map yourself. Make sure you understand what's being said here. Very important for a forester to understand legal description.
Hey, YG,
Yeah, go ahead, Riley.
which exam is this from?
October 2019.
October 2019. Thank you.
It's a great question. I love this question. I was 20 years old when all the legal descriptions clicked in for me. I can still remember the day. I was in Curry County, Oregon. It was kind of rainy and overcast, and I was looking at a possible trespass on some redwood country. It's like the only place that redwood grows in Oregon. And my dad was just explaining to me what the legal descriptions were that we had to follow. And finally, after like a year and a half, it all clicked in for me. Like, I get it now. With power like this, there is no stopping me. Anyway, it was a great day for me. That's the map. So what you're going to want to do, there's going to be a thing here where you talk about like the acreage. I'll leave that to you to figure out. There's going to be a thing here where you count the contour lines and figure out the slope. I want you to do that and figure out what grade. But the main thing I want to point out here is this dark line here that says Old Road. That's the road you're going to be using. That's the one that bisects the property. There's no other roads in here on this property, correct? And remember that the hall is going to go this away to the west. So whatever you design, it has to be geared to going to the west. How many of you remember what I said about break and slope from last week? Remember me talking about break and slope? Your job here, the next step you're going to have to think about is you're going to have to look at this and decide where is my tractor ground and where is my cable ground. So if you look here in the northwest of the northeast quarter, you'll see this area here, which is on the property. Pretty steep, huh? A lot of contours there, a lot of water courses. But between the main road and about in here, it's not bad ground. Not bad at all. Which suggests a possible road location. Why? Because if you put the road at a break-in slope, that's the place where you can set up your cable, your tower, whatever, to get that cable ground below. Plus, you can set up landings so that the cats can ground skid downhill to the road. It's a 2-for-1. You're getting the best break possible on the cat ground because it's gentle slope, but it's also whatever slope there is all downhill from the main haul road. You can put a road in here that basically is damn near flat, very little grade. And you can reach all this stuff up in here. So I want you to lay out a road system. Think of it in 2 steps. You're doing one for the stuff that's above, north of the old road, and one for south. Again, down here, I want you to do the same thing. Where's the cat ground and where's the cable ground? I think you can pretty well see this ain't no cat ground right here. It's steep. It's got a class 2 or something like that here. This over here, it's not too bad. It's a hogback. It's a ridge. But you're probably not going to go down off that hogback into that stream. This up here, not bad. This over here, clearly cat ground, right? Pretty flat. Here are water courses. Here are springs. Here's another water course. Here's another spring. Your job is to design an efficient road network that will allow you to access that property. It doesn't say no crossings. You can have crossings. It doesn't say that you can't have all the area available to you. You do want to try and make all the area available to you. You just want to design it with a minimum number of crossings that efficiently uses the ground. There are a couple different ways of doing it. I want you all to try, and then next week I'll draw you up what I would have done for this particular thing at the start of the lecture before we move into a different topic. But I really want you to try this. Any questions about what I'm talking about here? You got a couple of maps you can use. Go ahead, Kareem.
So there's a word in the diagram I can't make out. Is that supposed to be spring?
Swampy areas or bottoms? Is that the one you're talking about?
South of the old road.
You're talking about in the legend, or?
No, actually on the.
Oh yeah, spring.
Okay. Thank you.
That is spring. You'll see it a little bit better. I wish they would redo this map a little bit. It kind of is a little bit, I don't like the faded part. Alex.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure I'm getting this right. You need a new road one on the north side and one on the south side of the old road.
Yep.
And do they both need to come back to the old road before leaving the property?
Yep.
Okay, got it.
You do not have for the purpose of this discussion, you do not have a right of way across the adjacent property owner. You must use your property to get there. Look, you won't be if you come up with something different than what I would come up with, that's fine. You just have to show me an efficient layout that minimizes crossings and yet still provides access to the ground. It's okay if you want to fuss with it some and figure out, various things. That's why there's two pieces of paper. Make sure that when you do this, you talk a little bit about where the campground is. I think this exercise, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember it correctly, calls for you to put in potential landing spots. So give that a whirl. And then next week, I want to make sure you guys give it a shot. Next week, I will, in real time, do what I just did here with the PDF drawing thing and show you what my road design would be. And then you guys can raise your hands and say, oh, you're so full of shit. I would have done this. And that's fine. I'm okay with that. I'm a big boy. I've designed enough roads that were questionable. Did you really mean to put in a 15% grade here? Yes, I did. It's a feature, not a bug. Okay. I'm going to go back into the question. Edwin, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question. So looking at the map and just for I don't know, just to make sure that I'm kind of thinking about this process right. Mm-hmm. When designing a road, say at the southern part or the north part of the 34, and I'm just kind of thinking, is it better to have a longer road with less steepness or a shorter road with more steepness? And what is the kind of like the cutoff to say, I don't know, is it like 30% for a road, or does it matter? Does it depend on like the budget? Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just thinking about all this stuff and like what really would be a way to think about the answer without trying to think about all these other variables.
Okay, so I will tell you that you're going to want to keep your roads at max. You don't want to go over 15%. All right?
15%?
15%.
Gotcha.
Okay. And remember, part of the consideration here, if you're looking at this map the same way I am, all the haul is going to be adverse.
I don't know what that means.
Adverse, I mean it's going uphill.
Okay.
If it was a favorable haul, you could maybe exceed that 15% for short periods because the load is with you and you're going downhill. You're only going to burn up some brakes, but you're not going to spin or anything like that. So what you want is a nice grade coming out. You guys, I saw some of my dad's homework from Cal. They didn't design these kind of roads. You know what they designed? Railroads. And if you want to like really learn about how to lay out a road, go out with a guy that learned how to lay out railroads. Because he got really antsy every time I went over 2%.
Cool.
Hey, YG,
right. Better idea.
Hey YG, I got a quick question. How do you interpret, and this may be a silly question, but I'm used to shooting slopes in the field, checking all this, most of my roads I work on are existing. What's the good technique for taking a topographic map and estimating slope percentage? Like, yes, we can look at, I imagine it's a calculation based off the distance in the topography lines. right? But so, for example, I'm looking at the map here on the left is section 34, right? The big steep area next to the class 2. How can you technically guess that that's going to be exceeding, say, oh, that looks, I mean, it looks steep, but how do you know that it's going to be over 30% or without going to the field in a preliminary layout like this? Is there a way to estimate slope percentage?
As Parsa says in the chat, it's rise over run. So in the thing there, you've got your contour interval of 25 feet, 1 inch equals 330 feet. So like the best thing you can do is how many contour lines did I just cross and for what distance? So I don't have a calculator here, but we'll just let me just posit a scenario for you. Okay. Let's say that I cross a couple of contour lines. That's 50 feet, and I did it in 1 inch. That is exactly 15.15%. You'll have a calculator with you. Look, it's kind of hard to always get it exactly right. We're not going to like do a shit ton of calculations here, but I'll just give you an example. If I see a road that's going like this, wrong answer, hero. That's not going to work. That's going straight down the hill? No. You guys are going to be designing roads that go gently across the contours like that. So that was Alaska in the 60s, according to Dad, up the contour. So I am just old enough to remember seeing some of the roads that were built in the bad old days out in the Mattole. And trust me, as long as those guys, I guess their main thing was don't hit the brakes and hope for the best. Scary as hell. So give this a try. Any other questions about what I'm asking you to do? This is kind of the key thing for next week. I want to see that you guys understand how this works. I want to see that you understand where the tractor ground is, where the cable ground is, how to do an efficient road layout so that you can access the whole property. And I'll show you what my example of that would be. Rachel.
So I just noticed Electra's comment in the chat. Would we get a ruler on a question like this?
There's nothing wrong with bringing a straight edge if you want to bring one.
So we can measure scale?
Yeah.
Okay.
The alternative is that you cut up a piece of paper and you use it as your straight edge, or you use the edge of a piece of paper, but I wouldn't recommend it. The thing I notice about this, I don't know if any of you guys noticed it or not, it kind of ticks me off a little bit. When is it a good idea to put a map without a north arrow and a little scale at the bottom? The answer is it's never a good idea. If you submitted this map to CAL FIRE, they'd shove it right back up your keister because it'd be like, what the hell? You have to put a scale here because in reproduction, Xeroxing, sometimes it gets a little bit less, a little bit more in the reproduction, but that scale remains constant. So you always have a scale, like a 1 inch scale that represents 330 feet and a north arrow. Always. I'm going to lodge a complaint with the examiner. Your map is unacceptable. I don't think they would kick it all if you brought a straight edge. I always carried a K&E 6-inch scale in my pocket, always. I love those things. Don't leave home without it. But I'm old school, very old school.
Would it be best to just assume that we might need a ruler on the exam and just bring one?
Yep.
Okay.
%. Just make sure it isn't a hollow ruler, complete with, hidden notes.
Well, I didn't think about that until now.
I don't know that anybody's ever tried any shenanigans like that. But, a straight edge is perfectly fine. If for some reason you find yourself in a situation, Rachel, where you don't have a straight edge, I would strongly urge you to write, this is the best I can do freehand. I do not have a straight edge.
Okay, thanks, Mikey.
You bet. The graders will understand. I've graded this question a couple of times, and the key thing here is, can you read the map and see what the terrain looks like? Can you feel, looking at the contours? Can you understand exactly what it is you're trying to do? Yes. Shenanigans like that go into code. Good moral character. Yes. I'll have more to say about that at the CLFA annual meeting when I co-teach the ethics discussion. Any other questions about this assignment?
So, YG, I kind of put something in the chat. This is green about having more than just black pen. If we can have some different colors.
So I posed that question to Dan Stapleton at the RPF exam prep seminar. Could you have a highlighter to help you organize? And so his response was somewhat vague. He said, it's going to depend on the proctor, I guess. But I'll come back to that, Jan. I want to come back to that question you just posed. I don't really see a problem with bringing a highlighter. I really don't. But I would like to see Dan and the PFEC clarify that, bringing some different colors if there is a mapping question. The main thing is that the questions, when you're writing out prose and text, has to be answered in black ink to ensure that it reproduces accurately. Because what they do is they scan these things. We want to make sure that everything scans correctly. Now, going back to Jan's comment in the chat, color coding isn't allowed in THPs. I recognize that. And that rule has existed forever. Because when that rule first came out, color copying was not ubiquitous. Everything, when you Xeroxed something, was black and white. And therefore you couldn't use color coding. I think it's high time that the board reconsider that rule Because when I do even 20 something years ago when I was doing THPs, I thought this would be so much easier instead of using shading over my contours or cross hatching or whatever. If I said, hey, everything in yellow is cat ground and everything in light blue is cable ground, and I made it faint enough to where you could see the underlying contours, it would be much more intuitively obvious. Yeah. Yeah, everything is, the technology has changed. I think it's an archaic rule personally. If there's some problem with reproduction, they could always ask you to redo the map without color. But like, we should be able to, like, given the amount of information that is now necessary in a THP and you're trying to put maps together, wouldn't color coding make a lot of sense to make it like be more obvious to everybody? It just strikes me as weird. I don't know whether it'd be ADA compliant. You're talking to a guy that's colorblind. And yet even I can determine the differences in color shades. My biggest problem was that I could never pick up red flagging against a green backdrop, which is why I never used red flagging if I could help it. Edwin, you have a question, your hand's up.
Yeah, kind of stupid, but so specifically black ink only for the data of the exam.
Yeah, so that is to make sure that it reproduces the same for everyone.
All right, now I gotta ask because there's these new pens that you can erase with. Is that allowed? Is that a thing? Like, do you know? Do you not know? Do you care?
I don't think it makes a bit of difference. I happen to use those kinds of pens.
Yeah.
I'm left-handed, so, and I'm also a Virgo, so therefore I am anal retentive.
Okay.
And so I hate ink for a number of reasons. Left-handers write with a book, which tends to smear ink. If you want to see something very pathetic, watch a left-hander like myself learn to take calligraphy. It was the most frustrating class I've ever taken in my life. Could never get anything to turn out. But so I'm a pencil guy. I use pencil almost exclusively because I can erase it, won't smear, blah blah blah. But the black ink is so that everybody is operating from the same basis, so that the reproduction is the same for everybody. The color coding that was being suggested was more for organizing your thoughts, not necessarily for inputting your answers.
Understood.
Yes, it is tough out there for a lefty. If you've ever tried to like sign one of those electronic credit card things, you'll notice they're all set up for right-handers. I've noticed. Okay, any other questions? You guys, we're all clear on what needs to be done. Mike, go ahead.
Hey YG, sorry, and I've been slow on raising my hand because I'm using a new iMac and I have to like learn all these new codes. Regardless, I came into the group late, so it's only my second group meeting, and I'm wondering, for preparation for taking the exam, do we need to get pre-registered? When I looked at it years ago, you kind of had to get pre-registered in the sense of like vetting your qualifications and everything. Is there a spot, and I'm sorry if you've already addressed this in the group, is there a spot on the website on CAL FIRE where I should start kind of getting those ducks in a row in preparation for a April or October exam?
So it's not pre-registration per se. What it is you can ask the executive officer for licensing, Dan Stapleton, dan.stapleton@bof.ca.gov, for an evaluation of your qualifications. So typically people want to have, does this add up to 7? Is the key question, right? So one of the things that he has to spend a lot of time on, and it's useful rather than waiting till the time you actually apply to have a definitive answer. What happens if you don't have a bachelor degree in forestry? What if you have it in a closely allied field? How much of that will translate to your qualifications? So let's say that your degree is in wildlife. A bachelor degree in forestry, especially one from an SAF accredited university, is an automatic 4 years. You get 4 years for that, for your experience requirement. If it's something like wildlife, then it's a little different. Then you're talking about, okay, you may have not taken like mensuration. You may have not taken road design. So you're going to want to have your transcript evaluated. For the purposes of this discussion, for an evaluation, it doesn't have to be an official transcript. It just has to be a transcript of some sort that he can look at and evaluate and say, okay, this counts, this counts, this counts. And then can tell you, okay, let's just say maybe 3 of the 4 years of your wildlife degree count toward your experience. You're missing some core forestry things, but that 3 years can count towards it. In the old days, they probably wouldn't have given it much thought. They would have just said, you don't have a degree in forestry, but we've changed that. Steven says, I have a rangeland degree. Email Danny, confirmed that that would count for 2 years towards education and supplement for work experience. So there you go. There's a range example. By the way, occasionally there are rangeland questions, although they've become rarer now. So it just depends. That's the typical evaluation. Another evaluation is, I did this kind of work, I did this kind of work. Does this count towards my experience requirement? And he'll evaluate that as well. They are in the process right now of reevaluating what counts as work experience and what doesn't. Because when I applied low these many years ago, people followed more or less a traditional path. They had a bachelor from an SAF accredited university or a bachelor degree in forestry, and they worked in strictly forestry for an RPF. That has changed drastically in the last 40 years. People have varying levels of experience from varying different sectors. The best thing you can do is go to Dan and say, email him and say, could you evaluate me and tell me what I have? How close am I? And then he can do that. That way you know for sure whether or not you're going to be able to apply. So if he says you're a year short, then you know. Any other questions?
Yeah, I got one just to piggyback on what you just said. So at the end of the day, Dan Stapleton has the last and final say whether you can or can't qualify for the exam. So basically, you have to wait for his word.
Yeah. Pretty much, although I should not say last word. In certain instances, he brings that before the examining committee for their, if it's an unusual or novel case, he will bring it to the examining committee for their input. So he will talk to the professional foresters examining committee, say, I have this scenario here, this is the way I evaluated it, what are your thoughts? So if it's a close one, if it's a close call, then he'll bring it to the PFEC for further evaluation. Ultimately, your acceptance into the exam is an action taken by the professional foresters examining committee. The executive officer presents the applicants for the exam, and they take a vote to say, yes, all these applicants are qualified.
Understood.
If we've cleared in years past, like I cleared with Matt Diaz in 2014 and been working still ever since. Should we even go through that process again with Dan now? or just, I mean, we don't have documentation anymore. We've cleared our city emails since then, but, or would you recommend that we?
If you got cleared 10 years ago by Matt, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Then you're probably okay. I assume you've been working in some form of forestry. I don't know, was Mark Andre your supervisor, or?
I've worked on every single plan. Yeah.
Okay. I'm pretty sure you're okay, Mike.
Thank you.
Yeah. Every time I went, you submit the first and last page at a minimum. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Electra. Would you please clarify your comment in the chat?
Yeah, so if you want to retake the test, you have to submit to Dan the first page and the last page of the application form.
Oh,
so
right.
like
Yes.
I'm retaking the test, so I didn't fill out the middle part necessarily. And he says unless you've changed jobs or something like that, then you can fill out the middle part. But the first page where that's your information and your site request, like if you want Reading, Eureka, or Shingle Springs. And then your last page, which is where your signature is, those are required every single time.
Right. So two different things here.
Okay.
The first is if you've never sat, right? If you've never sat for exam, but in this case, Mike was notified 10 years ago that like he was qualified to sit. It's unlikely that he's going to be now told 10 years later, you're not qualified to sit. So Mike, I'm going to assume that you have 7 years experience, forget education, right? So
yeah, I mean, I've been 20 years experience plus.
Yeah, so
I just didn't remember. I remember last time with Matt, I totally provided a transcript and went to the college and got it all mailed out. It was official at that time, and I had an email that I kept for a number of years, waiting for when I actually was going to take the exam. And since then, that's long gone. And I was just wondering if I should actually go through that process again, or just assume registration that I'm going to be.
But to go back to what Electra was saying is if you have sat for the exam previously and you're reapplying to take another exam, you don't have to fill out an entire application. All you need is that first page and the last page. They already have everything else on file. Okay, they know you're a retaker and they already have a file on you. There's no need for you to submit additional information. You've already proven it, you've already sat, you've already qualified. It's just a matter of like reapplying, and so they minimize the amount of paperwork you need. So that was Electra's point. In your case, I don't think I'd worry about it too much.
Yeah, thanks you for your time on the matter.
Sure. All right. Any other questions tonight? Because I've kind of covered what I wanted to cover. You guys can, certainly, yeah. So you'll be notified pretty quick on sitting for the exam. If you've applied, you'll be hearing back from him pretty shortly. He's in the process of putting it together right now. I think it'll be in the next few weeks that you'll know whether or not you're sitting, whether your application is accepted. You guys have your keywords. Work on that. You guys have an example question that I want you to practice writing an answer out for. As always, if you want to run stuff by me, you can, but I cannot see samples of your handwriting. I cannot. That is verboten. No. And then I want you to really work on that map and other aspects of that problem if you have the time. And then next week I will lead off with that, and we will start delving into other topics beyond engineering. But I thought this was important because I just felt like this was where they're going to go. I'm going to look at the keywords and come up with a question. for us to examine next time and figure out how to work that. Anything else? Anything at all? Okay, hearing none, it's 8:20. Probably ought to get some rest. Hopefully this was helpful for you all. Drop me a line if you got questions. Always happy to be there and help you out, okay?
Thanks, YG.
Take care.
Thank
guys.
you.
Thank you, YG.
Record.